the ultimate failure we've had in this climate policy polarization and debate for as long as I've studied it is a failure in communication, because we have disseminated information top down as scientists in one package without recognizing that there's so many different types of demographics out there and interpretations, innate values, trust, and we have not respected those differences, and that's why we're in this polarized climate. So I study this through the lens of behavioral science. How many of you in this audience know what that is? Are somewhat familiar with it? Okay, for those of you who don't, behavioral science encompasses a lot of disciplines. It's a relatively new discipline. It comes from psychology, behavioral economics, neuroscience, cognitive psychology, and together, individually, none of those disciplines can explain the phenomenon of human behavior. But combined, and with this research and collaboration across all of these different disciplines, we've come up with behavioral science. And this is not to be confused with behavioral therapy, which is when you sit with a counselor and you have structured sessions. I am not a therapist. Do not tell me your problems. You'd be shocked how many times I get questions in Q&A. That's personal. We're talking about the climate. It's a collective issue. We're going to solve together. So the reason I study behavioral science is to really try and get to the bottom of what's going on here. Why, despite having all the best knowledge, are we still ignoring this overwhelming problem that really, in its worst case scenario, might just wipe our species off the map, right? The reason for it is actually relatively simple. We are innately wired. Our brains are not too different from the dawn of our species. We haven't evolved fast enough to catch up to the risk environment that we find ourselves in. And it's worked really well for the majority of our existence in that our ancestors would see a snake or see a tiger, and their immediate response, because of the way our brain is wired and processes risk, is to run away, is to fight or flight. And anyone who didn't do that, we are not descended from, right? So this is where our brain still exists, and we resemble closer to where we need to be, really, if we're going to address the really complex risk landscape that we now find ourselves in. We're not supercomputers, so we cannot, all the inputs that are coming in, we're looking at artificial intelligence, we're looking at cybersecurity issues, infectious disease, food security, water scarcity. It is so complex of an environment that we have created through human ingenuity and progress, but we can't process it. It's a lot, it's overwhelming. So when that happens, what ends up happening is we either shut down or we reach for some biases that allow us, innate sort of characteristics that we have is what I mean by that, that allows us to protect ourselves from the uncomfortable reality of the risks that surround us. When we start to come up against anything that challenges that protection, we experience what we call cognitive dissonance. And that's what is that uncomfortable feeling you get when the existing narrative in your head is put up against or challenged by new information, right? So I'll give you a personal example. I apply behavioral science to communication. I do a lot of media. And I was on the Bill O'Reilly show. And Bill O'Reilly asked me about climate change, and there's a clip, it's about 10 seconds, of him agreeing with me, which I love to share, because if they can take clips out of context, so can I, and I love to be able to show a conservative, talk show, right-wing host like him saying, okay, I agree with climate change. I'm like, victory. So what happened after that interview was a lot of backlash, right? I've got tons of death threats. I was told to go back to my country, the foreign state of New Jersey. I experienced a lot of what I, as a behavioral scientist, recognize as cognitive dissonance. And that's okay. Rather that, right, than no response at all. Because to overcome some of that barrier, that's going to be the natural reaction that people have. They're going to push back against you. So now some of you might be thinking, oh, I'm immune to this. I'm rational. I don't have these innate biases. So let's try an experiment, okay? I'm going to give you 2 risks and think about what the annual fatalities are with these 2 risks of last year. So the 2 risks are death by radon gas exposure versus death by gun homicides. How many people think there were more deaths by radon gas last year? Raise your hand. You can look around. Okay. And how many of you think it's more deaths by gun homicides? Raise your hand. It's radon gas. You shouldn't be surprised that I was doing sort of a brain trick here. And the reason here is obvious, right? We are conditioned to retrieve information that is easier and more salient and more sexy and in the media and propagated. Those are easier for us to remember and process. And because of that, we attribute more frequency and probability to it. Versus something like radon gas, which a lot of you here are hard scientists, so you might actually know. I didn't know what that was. Most audiences I come across are like, radon what, right? But guns you hear about all the time. So it's not surprising that this is one example of many of why we find ourselves in this situation where we are not aligned to the reality of what is going on. This is one example. In the interest of time, I'm just gonna keep it at that. I just want you to recognize, as we get into this conversation, that something like climate change, the reason we're here is because this is a slow-moving threat that it's hard to imagine it hitting us immediately and as extensively as it will. It's far in the future. It's not in my backyard. It's not really going to impact vulnerable populations, so people think, and when in fact vulnerable populations are getting hit the hardest. These are the challenges that we are up against with this particular risk that I look at in great detail. And the way to overcome it is to come up with effective communications that address that discrepancy between the reality of the risk and our perception of the risk. We need to overcome our cognitive limitations and really identify how to effectively create the message, as Dave was saying as well, and find the right people to communicate that message. It probably shouldn't have been me on Bill O'Reilly. I don't look like the demographic that I was communicating to, right? And that's okay. We need to understand the right person to send the message, because it's that trusted communicator, not what they're saying, because there's a lot of people communicating a lot of crap, and people believe it because they trust or they like that person. So keep that in mind as we move into Q&A, and we can talk more about it. Thank you.